Welcome back, everybody. So today we are going to be talking about macroeconomics, the stock market, the bond market, and we're going to be talking about how global powers basically shape the world. Now, most importantly, please make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe, and let's get into the rest of the video. In the last video, we were basically going over this Excel sheet, what was pretty much highlighting the income statement and the debt to GDP, the national debt, unemployment rate, and it was kind of looking at the income and balance sheet of the United States and where we currently are. Now, I'm not going to go over this entire sheet again, but I want to talk about other different types of aspects to the sheet, what I'll obviously be going over today. And I want to talk about how the United States basically imposes dominance, imposes policy around the world, and most importantly, how does China do as well? Now, they have very different methods in terms of imposing policy, obviously showcasing dominance globally, and the United States predominantly does this through loans and through its currency. So a lot of people basically say that the United States dollar is not necessarily backed by anything, and it very much is backed by something, and that is the United States. That is the United States military. How they typically do it is that they basically issue loans to other countries. So let's say you issued $10 billion to Turkey, for example, and let's say your interest rates in that specific currency, let's say the United States dollar goes up, that means the interest payments for Turkey significantly goes up. So typically what happens is that Turkey has to basically pay back that loan to the International Monetary Fund, to the World Bank, to obviously direct aid or whatever. And when they do that, they can have different types of clauses in them type of loans. So you might be able to pay you might be able to pay the loan back through commodities, obviously through oil, through corn, through fertilizer, through whatever. So you can see why loans would be a great mechanism in terms of extracting value from different types of countries. So what you typically see is that these countries weaken their currency against the United States dollar and makes the dollar more stronger in relation to obviously that specific country. So if we're just taking Turkey, for example, they could print more Turkish liras and obviously pay back that loan in the United States dollars by obviously going to the open market, buying the United States dollars, and then obviously paying the loan back in USD. What obviously would be great for the United States, but most importantly, it weakens the currency in Turkey, what basically makes their exports more attractive. And this is the whole idea of the International Monetary Fund, obviously World Bank loans, etc. Now, the thing is, there might be different types of arguments about why that is not necessarily the case, but from my perspective and my opinion, I think it's a very good way in terms of, let's say, extracting value from these countries, but basically tying them up into debt, what basically you control. And obviously you enforce that loan through military, you know what I mean, and basically through all of your financial systems, etc. So this is the reason why loans are an incredibly powerful tool when it comes to dominating around the world. Now, from the Chinese perspective, China basically has something called the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, what China specifically does is that they make investments in different types of countries, typically developing countries who are very rich in resources, because China is a large exporter of obviously goods and services. So obviously if you control the entire supply chain by basically making investments in these different types of countries, you basically control the entire stack when it comes to global control, when it comes to global supply chains. So there is two very distinct ways in terms of dominating control. Obviously, you can control things from a infrastructure perspective, or you can control things from a debt perspective. Now, like what I was talking about in my previous videos about the CNY, CNH spread. Now, this is basically when the spread starts to get elevated. It typically means that there is a significant amount of stress inside China. Now, typically what you'll normally see is that China wants a weak currency because it massively helps their exports. So if their currency starts to, let's say, appreciate against the United States dollar, their exports are not necessarily that attractive to investment. So, you know, this is the reason why they would be printing money or giving out infrastructure loans, etc. And you might have heard Trump mention this a few times about how China basically manipulates its currency. And this is how they typically do it. They do it through obviously issuing loans, debasing their currency. And this is why you typically see that a lot of Chinese investors really like, let's say, hard assets or things what are very scarce, such as gold, or other different types of precious metals or property, etc. Now, from a sector perspective on the United States, obviously the United States has the deepest, most liquid financial markets in the world. And some could argue that it has the most transparent governance in the world as well. Now, from a Chinese perspective, they basically have a lot of infrastructure. They have access to ports, rails, energy, And they are basically trying to control the entire stack when it comes to supply chains. Now, basically, how you enforce these different types of methods is through sanctions, through like swift exclusion. I mean, we saw that with the Russia and Ukraine invasion, that basically Russia got excluded from the SWIFT network. What basically is that like how you remit money around the world. But again, you want to be looking at things from a network perspective, because these are very, very, very important to kind of understand. Because ultimately, when you control these networks, you basically have a large amount of leverage when it comes to negotiations with other different types of countries, because ultimately other countries want to be inside that network, because a lot of people are obviously using that network. So obviously not being in the SWIFT payment network, it can be a bit of a problem from an international remittance perspective. Now, from a Chinese perspective, they basically leverage obviously a lot of these investments to basically try and extract assets and control, and you can basically control these different types of areas. Now, granted, a lot of the countries what China is involved in and obviously making investments in, they are not necessarily aligned with the United States. So you obviously have allies who are more aligned with the United States, and obviously you have Chinese allies who are most aligned with China for obvious reasons. And the vast majority of this is all to do with the debt market, all to do with the bond market. And this is what I keep reiterating about how the bond market is significantly important and why debt and loans are very, very, very important. It is not necessarily all to do with the stock market. The stock market is one piece of the puzzle, but understanding money flows and debt structures can give you a great holistic overview in terms of how the world is currently operating. Now, obviously, if you are giving out a lot of loans, what are obviously denominated in US dollars, you are making these countries heavily, heavily dependent on the United States dollar. And most importantly, you want to make sure that your policies are aligned with the United States, because obviously that can have large implications for new loans in the future. And this is how you basically force countries to basically get aligned from a policy perspective. And again, from the Chinese perspective, it is very much a very similar thing. I mean, obviously the reliance on Chinese trade and supply chains, because obviously if China is making an investment in your country, and obviously they start to build, let's say, warehouses, mines, or start to give a lot of grants in terms of building out a lot of this infrastructure, you are going to be heavily reliant on China, because ultimately you are going to be shipping that raw material to China. What ultimately is that is how you get paid, and most importantly, that is how you pay the loan back. This is what I really want people to understand, is that there is two very distinct ways in terms of how you control policy around the world, in terms of getting countries aligned with your way of doing things. I mean, ultimately, you are doing that through, obviously, loans, through investments, through absolutely everything. Now, how these projects are typically packaged, they are typically packaged up as economic reform programs, or budget stabilization programs, or rebuilding programs from the United States perspective. And from a Chinese perspective, they are typically packaged up as a way to kind of build out infrastructure, such as railways, ports, power plants. But ultimately, they are all built by Chinese firms. Now, obviously, if you are building a lot of that infrastructure, you are basically controlling that infrastructure. But the reason why you are controlling that infrastructure is because you have a vested interest to basically get them materials, get that products, get them services out of that specific country, ultimately back into China. And then ultimately you can build out your products and services and then ultimately ship it to different types of jurisdictions around the world. Now, the outcome of all of this is basically a lot of these countries are geopolitically aligned with you, obviously from a United States perspective, and they are obviously adopting the dollar significantly, because obviously they have to repay a lot of the interest back on the loans. Most importantly, a lot of the trade will be dictated in United States dollars. And the reason for that is because of the dominance with the military. So again, you enforce the dollar usage through military action, through loans, through the outcome for both sides is that you basically get them countries to be more aligned with you, obviously on a global stage. So obviously if you're getting a lot of investment from China, you want to make sure that your policies are aligned with China, because obviously you'll get more investment. Now, granted, this is exactly the same with the United States, and this is why you have different types of alliances from a United States perspective, and obviously from a Chinese perspective. You have different types of arms to obviously different types of countries, right? I mean, the biggest one is media influence. And this is what I was talking about before in terms of networks. I mean, you've got to think about these networks, CNN, Fox, Bloomberg, etc., different types of, let's say, global business and crisis narratives. And ultimately, it doesn't necessarily matter what is true and what isn't true. What basically matters is what does the vast majority of people believe is true, and who can basically shout the loudest. And this is why you have certain levels of control from a Chinese perspective and obviously from the United States perspective, because you do not necessarily want the other person to basically influence a lot of your population, because they will start to think very differently. Now, as you can probably imagine, you have different types of interests of why you would want to influence, let's say, different types of populations from the United States perspective, obviously from a Chinese perspective as well. And this touches on cultural reach. What basically is, let's say, Hollywood, films, Netflix, Marvel, Vice, I mean, pretty much everything what is in the United States, because ultimately that is all projecting how the United States is. You mean obviously using the language, etc. You are basically trying to get people into your ecosystem so you can basically, let's say, utilize them in the future. And again, this has large influence going forward. And again, this is very much the same from the Chinese perspective. And the thing is, from the Chinese perspective as well, you won't necessarily hear much from this side, because again, it's very, very limited. And again, it's vice versa. Majority of people in China do not necessarily hear much from this side, because again, it's very, very limited. It's limited by design. Now, let's talk about soft power tools. And this is basically looking at, let's say, Ivy League, USAID, peace corporations, of how you can basically get into different types of jurisdictions, different types of economies, and you can basically monitor just in terms of like how well they are currently doing. Obviously, any type of information is good information, right? I mean, the more information you can actually gather, the better it is going to be from a military perspective, and most importantly, to be one step ahead of your competitors. And this is very much the same from a Chinese perspective. I feel like they have different types of institutions, scholarships, what basically pushes Chinese students around the world. Now, what I've also done is I've broken this down into different types of sectors. So you can see here that we have payments, we have telecom, we have social media, cloud, trade partners, financial systems, monitoring technology, cybersecurity. And then we have here, we basically have the companies what are obviously aligned with the United States. From a payment perspective, obviously Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Swift, telecoms, Apple, I mean, social media, I mean, everything basically what we use, to be honest with you. And obviously China has very much the equivalent. And basically the reason why you want to, let's say, influence a lot of these countries is because you want to influence them by basically using your technology. Because if they are using your technology, you can basically, let's say, gather intelligence on how people are currently thinking about your country. And obviously you can turn things up, turn things down, depending on what type of network they are currently operating on. And this is the reason why I think we have seen a lot of debate around TikTok, because ultimately TikTok is definitely more aligned with Chinese systems and obviously Chinese values. And obviously utilizing TikTok on a daily basis is probably going to have be pushing certain agendas what are not necessarily aligned with the United States, what are probably going to be more aligned with Chinese values. And again, just think about what I was saying before, just in relation to you want to influence a lot of people over here, and obviously you want to influence a lot of people over here, especially if you're on different sides of the coin, right? And the reason why you want to influence is because you want people to think very differently, because ultimately, if they are thinking very differently, it is basically undermining the principles of these different types of systems. Because again, if people start to question the Chinese system, people are going to, there's going to be you could have a revolution, for example. And again, you could have the same different type of revolution from a United States perspective. Obviously, you see a lot of, let's say, influence from a Chinese perspective. So again, I can kind of imagine this is the reason why TikTok is specifically being targeted, or not necessarily being targeted, but this is the reason why TikTok is a big topic of discussion, because of the influence what it has in the United States. Now, what I've also done over here is I have broken down each country and how much US Treasury bills they currently own, and if they have any loans from a International Monetary Fund, World Bank, USAID, anything like that. And what you can kind of see is by the country, I have put on the right hand side what the major exports and resources are in that country. Now, what you'll find is that majority of these countries, what obviously have a lot of loans attached to them, have a significant amount of resources, what can be massively beneficial from a United States perspective. And this is the whole reason why I keep reiterating about the bond market, about why it's significantly important, and why, I know it might sound a little bit dark, but this is the reason why I believe that war can be seen as good from a monetary perspective. And now I know me saying that can be, it's very, very emotional, right? But what I'm kind of getting at is I don't mean it's good from a, obviously war is not good, right? Because obviously you have loss of life, what is obviously catastrophic, and everything what obviously comes with war. But what I mean is that with these countries, not necessarily the countries what I'm highlighting here, but what I'm kind of getting at is, let's say you take a country what is currently in a war. So let's say you take like Ukraine, or you might take, let's say India or Pakistan, or as that started to escalate the other day. What you'll find is that when it comes to rebuilding that country, they will be rebuilding through loans. So you'll be rebuilding through, let's say, the International Monetary Fund, who will lend money to Ukraine. And ultimately, Ukraine will have to pay back this loan, obviously in United States dollars. Now, when you start to look at, obviously, Ukraine's exports and resources, obviously they have a large amount of grain, steel, and uranium. Now, granted, why do you think the United States would be giving loans, for example, to Ukraine? It might be because that Ukraine has a significant amount of uranium, and you can be using uranium for power plants or for whatever. I mean, you can basically speculate all you want there, but this is what I'm kind of reiterating about why loans, why the bond market is a very, very, very important to understand, because ultimately, when you have a lot of war and a lot of destruction, you can basically issue a lot of loans for obviously rebuilding, and most importantly, that is how you extract value out of these countries, and you are basically making them more and more dependent and more aligned with the United States, rather than them being aligned with China. Now, I know what I'm kind of talking about might seem a little bit dark, but when you start to look at the money flows, it seems very, I wouldn't necessarily it seems very targeted or anything like that, but again, you can kind of see why you would want to influence certain countries from a Chinese perspective, obviously from a United States perspective, because ultimately, if these countries have different types of resources, you want them to be more aligned with you, rather than obviously being aligned with the competitor. So when you start to look at, let's say, China from a Chinese perspective, now, obviously, these are the amount of investments what China has been being made in different types of countries. Now, granted, you can see that a lot of these countries are in Africa, and a lot of these African countries obviously have a lot of raw minerals. And again, you can see it on the right-hand side here. Obviously, the main export and resources from a Pakistan perspective, textiles, remittances, copper, oil, coffee and coal. I mean, this was really, really interesting. I've never even heard of the country. I'm not even going to pronounce this country. But when I actually looked this country up, it made a lot of sense why China would want to have a lot of influence in that specific country, because it is it's very well positioned from a port perspective, obviously from a military hub perspective. And when I was digging deeper into it, 70% of their GDP from a long perspective is tied to China, because basically China built out their ports, railways, and basically everything inside that country. Because I'm assuming that China wants to have a lot of influence in that country, because it's, again, like what I'm saying, it has a lot of influence from a military perspective. Again, you can kind of obviously, you know what I'll do? I'll put it on the screen now, obviously, where that country is. I'm not going to pronounce it because I kind of struggle a little bit when it comes to reading. But again, you can go through the entire list of where a lot of these investments, let's say investments for infrastructure, from a Chinese perspective, and obviously you can kind of draw your conclusions just when it comes to the amount of influence what China will probably have in a lot of these jurisdictions compared to the United States. Now, what I also found as well, what is quite interesting, is this diagram over here. And you can start to see the amount of influence what China has in Africa from a solar perspective, hydro perspective, wind perspective, biomass, nuclear, etc. And obviously, you are basically controlling the entire supply chain. Now, this is why I keep reiterating about the bond market, because the bond market is very, very, very important, because everything is basically tied back to the United States dollar. And like what we've been talking about over the past couple of weeks and months, obviously, a lot of people hold US Treasuries as a safe reserved asset. And as people basically start to sell some of these assets to basically stabilize their own economies, what we can basically see is that the yield curve starts to tick up, like what we were talking about in our previous video. And as a result, the interest payment on the national debt basically becomes very, very, very unsustainable for the United States. But ultimately, there is a significant amount of pressure, obviously, on China, obviously through tariffs, and that's what I think the United States was trying to do, was basically trying to drive people back into US treasuries, or basically helps them to basically build and manufacture in the United States. Now, granted, that plan has not necessarily gone to plan, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I know I was talking about this last time. When it comes to the income statement, you can basically see that the United States doesn't really have much wiggle room in terms of going into another escalation. Now, when we start to see that there was a lot of stress in the CNY-CNH spread, we started to see basically overnight a massive escalation between India and Pakistan. Now, the United States cannot basically fund another war because obviously they're in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and India, because this massively has large implications in terms of their national debt. Now, obviously, as you can probably imagine, China is probably massively aware of a lot of these stresses, what the United States is currently under. And, you know, they are probably pushing more and more for them to be in a lot more stress from a financial perspective, obviously from a military perspective, because that has large implications in terms of destabilizing their system. Because ultimately, if you are wanting to become the next global superpower, you basically need to transition from a large exporter to basically being an importer. Now, how do you currently do that? You know, there's a lot of there's a lot of tactics to do that. And this is the thing, it's like, I know this video is probably very long, but I really want to explain to people there's a lot of moving parts to the bond market, and there's a lot of debt, what a lot of people are basically paying. And obviously, as these interest rates start to go up even more, that has a significant squeeze on the entire global economy. And ultimately, they basically have to obviously pay that interest rate back. If they do not pay that interest rate back, you will basically see escalations start to get more and more heated. And this is what I think is currently happening, obviously, in the Middle East. And something what I wanted to kind of highlight as well is just the US and the China military comparison. Now, from a United States perspective, obviously they have 1.3 million military personnel, and China has a significant. China basically has a lot more military personnel than the United States, but the United States basically, obviously, their budget is significantly higher than China. But again, you can start to see, obviously, on here, I've highlighted areas where China is beating the United States from a military perspective, and from a demographic perspective as well. You can kind of argue that China is kind of running out of time if they want to become the next global superpower. Now, what I mean by that is that China's demographics are very top-heavy, or they are going to be very top-heavy over the next coming years. So, again, you don't really have much time in terms of, let's say, dominating the world. So you really want to be moving quickly with this, obviously, if you are China. And this is why I think there's a lot of escalation around the world going on. Now, granted, what does all of this mean for the stock market? Obviously, there's a lot of moving parts to all of this, and I am going to do another video, obviously, just on the stock markets, an update on the stock market, and obviously how the bond market is influencing the stock market. Obviously, we've seen a lot of price movement from a oil perspective. You know, precious metals. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of volatility from a Bitcoin perspective, altcoin perspective. But again, I just really want to reiterate the importance of the bond market because when you start to dive deep into the structures of these two large superpowers, from a Chinese perspective, obviously United States perspective, you can start to understand. You can basically see what each one is trying to do, and ultimately, when you start to figure out what they are currently trying to do, you can basically try to, let's say, make bets in the stock market and obviously make a lot of money as a result. Now, granted, I know that I am touching on macroeconomics a hell of a lot here, right? And I'm obviously talking about a lot of geopolitics as well. But hopefully this video has kind of shared some insight. Now, granted, you can do obviously large videos on, I mean like hour-long videos on just the payment sectors of the United States, obviously with China, and look at these different types of comparisons about how, let's say, MasterCard or Visa can have large influence globally. You know, I mean, they are basically dominating credit card and obviously debit card payments globally anyway. But yeah, hopefully this has been obviously informative. Now just a little bit of an update from me. I am fully aware that I have not necessarily been that active recently. I do have a lot of business commitments. I run probably close to nearly 5 businesses. So I've been traveling a hell of a lot. I've been meeting a lot of people in Dubai. And, you know, I just haven't had the time to kind of jump on here and make any videos. But I just want everybody to know that this is very, very important for me to kind of obviously grow this YouTube channel. And some things just take time. And, you know, with all my other commitments, it is a little bit difficult because I don't really make that much money from obviously this YouTube channel and obviously from Instagram, and I'm heavily penalized on Instagram. So, you know, I am, I would probably say self-censoring to a certain extent on Instagram because I don't really want anything bad to happen to that account because I've spent a significant amount of money on that account. I spend a lot of money on a daily basis in terms of driving traffic and most importantly, getting followers to basically try and grow this YouTube channel to about 100,000 subscribers. So to give you some background, that is basically the reason why I have been slightly delayed because obviously I'm doing other business commitments, but hopefully I'm going to be doing more videos in the next couple of days, next couple of weeks. And yeah, please just bear with me. And to the 4 people who keep on supporting me, I hope you're having a lovely day and take care. Bye-bye.